some of the beliefs and then the actual structures and authority of the church itself. So his criticism grows from specifics to bigger and bigger issues and so on. And what I kind of skipped over last day that may be familiar to some of you if you've done reading on the Reformation before, but if you haven't, or if you have, it's a refresher. I think there are different ways to count this. Some people would maybe throw in a few more, but I think there are really 4 really powerful ideas that Luther was onto and that he was writing about and speaking about, particularly by about 1520. So between when he first gained a kind of public profile through the criticisms of the 95 Theses in October of 1517, and between that and April 1521, when he's at the Diet of Worms defending himself before the emperor and representatives of the Roman Church. Between there, his ideas are developing, and by 1520 he's writing extensively on 4 key ideas. 3 solas, and then another one that doesn't quite fit sola. So sola scriptura simply means scripture alone. The idea that the Bible would be the authority for belief and practice in the Christian life, that should stand alone as the authority. This was one of Luther's great emphases. And of course, it's not original with him. It's in many ways a rediscovery, but sola scriptura is so important for understanding the Reformation. Sola gratia means grace alone. Grace alone. And that's the idea that salvation comes through the grace of God directly, not through the merits of Christ or the saints or the Virgin Mary or anyone else, but just through the grace of God. Sola fide means that salvation comes through faith alone and not through works, not through effort. And the Protestants were, like Luther and other reformers, were quite keen to make a sharp separation between their theology of justification by faith alone and Catholic theologies of salvation, which included a kind of a cooperative human element, and that they saw as works, and they rejected that idea. And then the 4th key idea that we have to understand, I think, is this notion of the priesthood of all believers. That Luther, and this is in some ways for the church and even for society, maybe the most radical and impactful principle of the Reformation, that there weren't 2 kinds of Christians, that there weren't the clergy who were a higher status of Christian, a better Christian by definition, no matter what their life was like, just by definition, by being clergy within Catholicism, because being a member of the clergy is one of the sacraments. And so there's a sense in which that's a higher level of Christian. And the reformers reject this idea, and they say everyone is a Christian in the same way. Clergy may have a different function, but that's not a different status. It's not a different kind of Christian. And so their argument, and we'll read about this on Friday in the documents, is that everyone should be a Christian in the same way. And that's the priesthood of all believers. So I just wanted to back up and talk just a little bit about that to set us up for tonight. So I want to jump into the Luther film now. And maybe just it would help me just to know, I don't know how you can indicate, maybe in the chat, the 2003 Luther film, which stars Joseph Fiennes as Luther, that's him there. So how many of you have seen that film and, sort of are familiar with that? We have a number of, a number of are familiar with it. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'll be asking questions along the way. We won't necessarily stop too long on them, But if you have comments to them, just use the chat, and then, Colin or Tim, whichever of you are going to do that, you can weigh in and say, hey, here's some answers, and we can stop and talk a little bit more if we need to along the way. But the first thing I want to say, when I teach a course on history at the movies, history through film. And one of the things that, film is so important for history because so many of us get a lot of our history through movies. And it's tempting for us, and the movies want us to think this way. The movies don't really want us to think. They want us to experience the past. And they want us to just believe that we're entering into the past and not realize that that a movie isn't a direct window into the past, right? I mean, there's so much that's different. Films all have their structures and conventions. Hollywood films all have, or most of them have, similar sort of plot structures. They introduce a conflict, then they work it through, and then there's some kind of resolution, usually with an uplifting ending at the end. That's kind of how they're structured. And they use various conventions. They compress time, they combine events, they create fictional characters, they create composite characters by combining several people into one sometimes. And so if we're worried about films getting every detail right, it'll be frustrating because they don't. But what can they do? At their best, historical films, they show us a filmmaker's vision of the past. So it's another way of telling a story of an event. And it can wrestle with big thematic issues. It can raise questions about the past and so on. So we want to think about films in that way. So my starting question to you is, did you think, or have you thought, with Luther, those of you who've seen it, what is actually the theme of the film? Like, what message does the film want us to take away? Anybody have any thoughts about that? What should we think about the film? It's a little different way to think about film. I'm curious. The end of the film gives us some hints about the theme. When the film ends, then there's some script, and it talks a little bit about how, Luther's Reformation opened up religious freedom in the world and so on and so forth, which it didn't really, at least not right away. But we like to think that. So maybe that's part of the message of the film, that Luther's Reformation brings us religious freedom. That's one way. Maybe it's, the process of struggle, certainly, and thinking. It's interesting you use the word thinking, Rolf, because one of the, we certainly get Luther's really wrestling with lots in the film, that's for sure. We get a lot of wrestling. But it's interesting, we'll come back to that idea of thinking and what we learn about the thinking of the Reformation in the film. And certainly the idea that the church needed reform. Yeah, there's certainly some of that. Well, if you got to the end of the Peasants' Revolt, you got most of the way. And so, and it is a sort of a mixed bag, isn't it? Yeah. So it's interesting to me to think about what story or stories that the film tells and what stories it doesn't tell. So let me give you just one example that we won't get into in detail, but it helps to think about it. If you were to Google Luther timeline and find one of the many timelines of Luther's life, particularly one that's got lots of detail, and you start looking through, you'll notice some things that the film captures and some things that the film doesn't. And what it captures is some of the key events some of the key events of Luther's life. What it doesn't capture, actually, is a lot of the thinking that he does, a lot of the learning. That's hard to do, actually. You might not think so, but what people like Colin and I do all day sitting in our offices, it's not the most riveting thing in the world if you were to film it. When our kids were young and we were in Germany for a year doing research, our oldest child was about 3 years old, Liz, and one day we saw her in her little spot that she could play in our place, and she was taking paper and she was moving paper from one pile to another and just moving paper around. And we said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Well, I'm playing archives." That was the life we were living. I was working in an archive doing research, but it's not exactly the most riveting thing. And so one of the interesting things about the film is that it doesn't show us a lot of the intellectual development that's going on behind the scenes. We just get kind of the outworkings of that in the big events. And that's because films are always character-driven and event-driven. They have to do that. And we'll even see two specific cases where we do want to learn about certain texts, certain documents, and actually the film uses all kinds of motion and action to get at a text, a document. So we'll see that. So let's jump in. So there's a bunch of questions here. I'm going to pose them, but I won't stop very much. But you just jump in, use chat, and so on, and I'll just sort of talk through questions and again jump in, and I can see chat better tonight, so I'll try and catch them too. So one of the questions we always ask with a film is, what's the opening scene? And here the opening scene is the storm. Luther's stumbling through a massive lightning storm. He almost gets hit by shafts of lightning. And it's this seminal moment. It's this, again, we talked about it last day. It was this sort of mythic event, this caught in a lightning storm in 1505. So why begin there? Well, from a filmmaking standpoint, it's a great hook, right? It's an immediate burst of action, danger, excitement, crisis. So that's a good way to start a film. Because, right away we see, there's something going on.
Your screen isn't shared.
Oh, thank you for telling me my screen isn't shared. That is the value of having your wife on the session. It's a good thing that she said that, because you would not be able to see very much. So are you seeing that now?
Yep, we can see it now.
Thank you. Sorry, you didn't miss much. That's all you missed. And welcome, Kate. Good to see you here too tonight. Why can't I get back to here? Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to get myself organized here again. For some reason now I cannot see my controls and I can't see my chat.
If you click those buttons at the bottom of the screen, Kyle, they should pop up as secondary windows. But it depends on how big your...
Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah, I'll use the chat as a secondary window. Thanks, that's good.
Yeah, no problem.
Appreciate it. Sorry, technical glitches. There, I think we're good now. Okay. Why begin with the storm? So, danger, excitement, crisis. Right away, we have action, and that's a good way to start the film. And it's important for Luther because right away, it's this, movie makers don't like lawyers, that's good. Because it is this moment where his life starts to take a different trajectory, right? He goes from law school into the monastery, and this starts his spiritual journey, in effect, that ends up in the Reformation. So that makes sense as a starting point. Now, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is about characters, and casting is always important. And this movie is just classic for casting. Again, it's not the best movie in the world, but it actually is useful for talking about how a story like the Reformation gets portrayed in film, because it does some very conventional, very obvious things. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with movies, if you know who Joseph Fiennes is as an actor. I think his other notable film is Shakespeare in Love. I don't know what else he's done. Maybe he's done some other things that are important. But what is absolutely stands out about Joseph Fiennes when you see him on the screen? What is the thing that jumps out to you the most for those of you who watch this? Intense look.
Yeah, his intense
Yeah,
look.
that about sums it up. The eyes, the eyes. He is very emotional, very emotive, intense eyes, and he really can. He can just radiate emotion, particularly things like intensity and insecurity and doubt. Those eyes. And we got some great shots of his eyes. So that tells us that the filmmakers were trying to give us a certain kind of Luther. And I don't know if you've read about Luther or about the Reformation. I don't know what you think about this casting. Some people might like it, maybe not. I see what the filmmakers are trying to do. What they're trying to do is they're trying to capture his inner journey, his spiritual journey, and they want that emotiveness. They want that radiating that intensity and especially the insecurity. And this is actually quite an insecure Luther. Other renderings of Luther often have him as much more courageous, or much more, and he's courageous enough in the film, but much more intense and much more sort of rough. If you read his writing, a lot of times I say he wields words like 2x4s. He can be very brutal and he was very rough and ready as a propagandist, as a combatant in the Reformation. So it's a little out of step with that. It's a little at odds with that. But it does give us this emotional side and the spiritual journey. And we go right away from this experience, we jump forward 2 years. So we don't talk about how he started out in the monastery and all that. We come right to another event, and that is his first Mass as a priest in the Augustinian monastery church in Erfurt. And some of us on Reformation trips have stayed in the Augustinian monastery. It's a neat place to stay, and you can see all these places that they shot the film, because they did use the church. And here they were. He's at his first Mass, and he is very angsty. He's very emotional. This shot is from that scene as well. And his father comes, and he's nervous, and there's lots of other reaction shots. And no, the movie's not dubbed. It was an English language film. And so he messes up. He spills the blood of Christ, right? And this is important. And so he has this terrible. It goes terribly for him, and he's very, very upset. His father leaves. His father's angry at him for not sort of doing good by the family and going into law, etc. And here again, the filmmakers, they're channeling particular interpretations of Luther. And there are two here that we can talk about. The first is this idea of conflict with his father. That's overdone a little bit in the film, but it also was the way people thought about Luther, and that's partly because of an influential book by a scholar named Erik Erikson in the 1950s, who wrote a book called Young Man Luther, which was a kind of psychoanalytical historical interpretation of him. And Ericsson's idea was that a lot of Luther's story comes from the fact that he had this conflict with his parents and so on. So the filmmakers are picking up on that interpretation a bit here. Also, the very emotional, the very spiritual Luther, and this carries over into the following scene when at nighttime after this Mass, and he's failed so badly, he's in his cell and he's cursing at the devil, and it's one of 3 scenes in the film where he's arguing with the devil. And this again picks up on a prominent interpretation of Luther, and of course there's lots of material to back this, by a scholar named Heiko Obermann in the early 80s, wrote a book called Luther, Man Between God and the Devil. And Obermann argued that you could really understand Luther best if you understood him as somebody who believed that God and Satan were involved in a cosmic battle and he was right in the middle of it. So what that means is that he's got, this highly spiritual, highly emotional, sometimes very doubtful or full of distress kind of emotion going on, and again that fits a particular kind of interpretation of Luther. Now this scene is important. So this first scene is important because it establishes his spiritual anxiety and also some conflict with his father, and that's a subplot. This scene is important. It introduces us to another father figure, Johann von Staupitz, his superior within the Augustinian order, who is very gentle, his voice is just lovely and warm, and he is caring for Luther here, and he has this debate with Luther, and Luther is he asks this important question. He says, "What is it you seek?" And this is a device in the film. This question is used at a couple of points. And it gets us at the root of the spiritual conflict that drives the film. Luther's own spiritual crisis that drives. He's angry at God. He thinks God hates him, and he wants a God he can love and who loves him. And then Staupitz has these words, bind yourself to Christ. Say, I'm yours, save me. I'm yours, save me. And so Luther, right away in these first couple of scenes, we've been introduced to Luther's personal crisis and then the beginning of the resolution of that. At least we see a way forward for him. And this continues in a couple of scenes down the road. But first of all, the next place we go in the film is to Rome. Now, what do we learn when Luther visits Rome? Well, it's not a great secret, is it? Immediately he's introduced to thievery, prostitution, drunkenness, carousing, violence, hawking of religious souvenirs, and the selling of grace, merit, I should say, through relics and indulgences. So he is very pious. Here he sees Rome and he's sort of enraptured. He sees relics and he's intensely, but he's also seeing other things that confuse him. And we have this scene where he goes to buy an indulgence, right? And it's just like a machine. It's just like an assembly line. It's so impersonal. It's so unpastoral. And in fact, what happens is he gets this indulgence, but along the way, as he's praying his way up the steps, he's distracted because he's uneasy about what's going on around him. Then he gets to the top and he sees somebody hawking more souvenirs, and his reaction is captured in this shot where he crumples the indulgence. So it's a very dramatic gesture that signals to us that he is starting to become disenchanted with the means of grace, relics and indulgences and so on, that the church is offering, and offering in corrupt ways. right? Any questions or comments so far? I'll stop here just for a second. Anyone want to jump in with any observations?
I mean, one of the things I think is interesting, a couple of things I think are interesting at this point. First of all, it seems like as a narrative device or as a film device, we have the Reformation is being played out both on like the historical stage and in the personal stage in Luther's life. Like Luther's sort of a microcosm. He's like a miniature version of what the film's trying to get at a big idea, but it's very hard to communicate, especially a big idea that's mostly about ideas. It's hard to dramatize. And so you dramatize it as a internal crisis in this one individual. So that, I think that's interesting. The other thing I was thinking, just especially in that last bit we were talking, it seems like the film is trying to, and this is, I think, actually sort of historically true to a degree, the film is trying to give us the sense that Luther is not coming up with these ideas out of the blue, but that in fact, both in positive and negative ways, existing forces in the church are provoking what will eventually occur, right? So he's got his superior in the order is sort of a positive influence that is, bind yourself to Christ is leading him down that road. But then also his trip to Rome is sort of pushing him away from the Roman church. Yeah. And so it's sort of, I don't know, I read that almost as the filmmakers, like I think this is sort of a great man of history film. And so we want Luther to be a good guy. And so the filmmakers they're relieving him of any burden of guilt, I think, at this moment for wrecking anything. He could only do what he could do, Yeah,
and we'll see. I'll show you another device that's a good way to put it between sort of the personal level and the larger, event-driven story of the Reformation. But it does work well, I think, as a device to see also Luther's own journey, and that's very well put. Yeah, good point. Good point. That in fact. Luther's not original. He's drawing on other things, and it's very much his context that makes his reform possible. So let's jump on. So next he is sent to Wittenberg. Here it's a little bit confusing time-wise because he first went to Wittenberg actually in 1508 as a student, but was sent there in 1511 by Staupitz. And so we're getting a little bit of both here at the same time. So he shows up in Karlstad's class, questions him about the salvation of the Greek Christians, and starts to raise this question of to what extent is salvation tied to the church or tied to Christ. So that's a key moment there. And then we have this other moment. As he's come into Wittenberg, he was introduced to this family, Otto, a builder, and his son Thomas, who pretty much right away commits suicide, hangs himself. Now, this is not a real event. This is, I've never heard of this. This is a film device. This is just a fictional event. And it's put in there because, again, we can't just show the inside of Luther's brain as he's working for 3 years, thinking through theological studies and coming to conclusions about grace and works and mercy and faith and things like that. So we have to see it embodied in something concrete. And that concrete thing is the suicide of a young boy that would normally put him outside of salvation. Suicide was self-murder. And so if that happened, that puts you outside. And that's why they don't want to bury him in the churchyard. Because his soul doesn't belong there, as it were. His body doesn't belong there. His soul won't be with the others. Luther rejects this, and you see one of these very determined looks in the upper right side of the screen. Before that, the night before, he's arguing with the devil, and he's just arguing with the devil about how, and his explanation when he's burying Thomas is that he was attacked by the devil, and that's as real as if he were ambushed and murdered on the road, right? And that's what I meant before when I talked about that permeation between the material world and the spiritual world. And so Luther buries him, and he uses the same language that he's gotten from Staupitz, right? I'm yours, save me. He's yours, save him. Save him. Is it fair device? Would he have buried his suicide? I don't know. I at this point, I doubt it. It's a pretty radical move. What I'm not showing you here is that the filmmakers have other people, important characters, and I'll come back to this. I'm skipping this deliberately. Other people are watching Luther and learning from him and getting a read on him. From there, he goes to preach about God's love. Otto and his wife are in the service. They're grieving still, but they're in the service. And you can see his character is evolving now. And he is now able to preach about love. Now, when this happens, I don't know. It could be anywhere between about 15, 14, and 17. And this is where the film is skipping over this sort of gradual theological development. Luther is lecturing in these years. He is writing commentaries on biblical books in these years. And he's preaching in these years. So this just fits somewhere in there. His lecturing is tricky because he first starts lecturing in 1512. So that's really where this should fit. But the indulgences piece only comes up in 1517. So we're mixing time periods here a bit. That's okay. And we see, though, the evolution of his character, right? That he is more confident. He's able to use humor. He's more the master of his ideas. And in both when he's preaching and when he's lecturing. So we're seeing a more confident Luther, and this is how the film is showing him evolving a little bit. And now, 28 minutes into the film, for the first time, we meet the antagonists. We meet the bad guys in the film, which are three in particular. On the left, you see Aleander, Jerome Aleander, or Girolamo Aleandro, and he was an official for Rome, and then also Cajetan in the red cowl there, who was a cardinal in the church, and then Pope Leo. And you see all these dates here, and that's because it's a bit of a mishmash that's happening at this point, because Leo X became Pope in 1513, but Albrecht didn't become Archbishop of Mainz till 1514. The indulgences weren't preached until 1517, and Aleander didn't come into Roman service till 1519. So if you're worried about dates and fussed about that, you're going to be not happy right now with the filmmakers. But that's what they did. And it's because they use Aleander very much as a foil or as an anti-Luther in the film. So they're bringing these people together, and we learn that they are very wealthy, that they live in luxury, and they're very political, and they're not happy with Luther. Alfred Molina as John Tetzel. I always think of Doc Ock at this point from the Spider-Man film from around the same time. Molina is a sort of just a consummate bad guy. He plays so many bad guy characters in his film history, and so his hair is dark. He's got a dark beard. He plays a good bad guy, and he really hams it up as Tetzel. And the crazy thing is, a lot of the really outrageous things he said, John Tetzel said. They're not actually making that up. They've got lots of, like when he talks about these indulgence, if you violate the mother of God, Tetzel said that. So here he is preaching his indulgences, this bad guy. And yeah, that's right. Luther's preaching love and Tetzel's preaching fear. And then we come finally to the question of indulgences and Luther's determination. You see his determined eyes again. And what happens here at this point is interesting, because what the filmmakers have to do here is they have to tell us about the 95 Theses. Now, we're going to look at them on Friday. They're not easy. and they're kind of complicated. And how do you spool that out in a film? Well, you have lots of action. Luther's on the move. Different people are reading the 95 Theses. They're printing them. They're distributing them. The Catholics are reading them, or Luther's a Catholic too, but the Catholics are reading them and getting mad. And there's lots of fairly quick cuts and a lot of action, movement on screen as parts of the 95 Theses are being read. So it's the filmmaker's way of kind of bringing that to life. And Luther continues to preach Christ as the Word. Again, so we've got the Bible is emerging more and more as a theme, and Christ as the source of salvation. So the film is sort of moving us along, showing us the growth in Luther's thinking and his beliefs and so on. And we're now sort of in 1518. Now, this scene in Augsburg, where Luther has to go meet Cardinal Cajetan. Of course, Aleander would not have been there. Aleander was there advising Luther on what to do. That can't have been because he wasn't in papal service for another year. But for the film's purposes, we need him there as kind of the anti-figure. So there he is. So there's quite a long scene here. And the question I would ask is, why is this such an important scene in the story of Luther and the Reformation? He's supposed to come to Augsburg. He's supposed to prostrate himself on the ground. Cajetan is supposed to ask him what he's going to do, and he's supposed to say, revoco, I revoke my ideas. And he's supposed to absolutely submit himself to the authority of the church. Well, that doesn't happen because Luther's Luther, and he's feisty, and he starts a debate, and he out-argues Cajetan, who's pretty angry by the time it's all over, pretty frustrated. So why is this scene there? It's an important event, I guess, so it's got to be in the film, but what is it doing in the film? What purpose do you think it serves? Any thoughts about that? What are the issues that are really bubbling up here?
We get at least part of it with that final scene where his superior removes him from his order, right, as a means of protecting him. So it seems like, so Rolf got there at the first official or formal break with the church. It does seem like this is, for the filmmaker at least, this is like the moment of breach, right? As a filmmaker, you got to have a time when you really have a true formal breach between the relationship.
Yeah. And good point also, Lisa, a chance to articulate ideas. Again, one of the ways you can articulate ideas is have people preaching them or arguing them or teaching them. And you can't do too much of it because it gets boring after a bit. But here Luther does get to articulate some ideas. And there's another sort of key phrase that comes out in this scene a couple of times. And then it comes out elsewhere in the film as well, and that is have a care. Have a care, Martin. Have a care. Be careful. And everybody wants him to have a care. But the key thing, the key idea that's being articulated, the key break in the church is over authority, right? Luther argues for Scripture. If the common people could read the Bible, the Pope is not above Scripture. He can interpret Scripture. He's not above it. And Aleander beforehand says that you're not here to debate. The Pope will decide what Scripture says. So this scene is really a clash between these two figures, showing that division between the Bible as an authority and the church. And Luther wants truth. So truth now is a word that starts to come out here as well.
Kyle, is it also reasonable maybe to say, especially with the the continual cautions to Luther to be careful, but they really mean to be careful for himself. Yeah. And this also sort of articulates that he's a man of the people, right? And so he's going to be a pastoral. He's going to give pastoral care to his people, even if it endangers himself, I think, to a degree.
Yeah, pastoral care to his people for sure, but also on account of the ideas, the truth. Like he's willing to risk himself for the truth, and that comes out as well, I think. But the film, I think, does a decent job of showing that. There were a number of places here where his life is very much in danger, and this is one of them. If Staupitz hadn't released him from his vows and sent him off, he could have been turned over at that point to the church authorities. There's a couple of times in the film, 3 times in the film, where the two camps are juxtaposed, are held up one against another. And there's 2 scenes here. One where Frederick, the Frederick the Wise of Saxony, the Elector of Saxony, Luther's prince, Luther's ruler, and Spalatin, his chief advisor, they are discussing their strategy about what to do with Luther, how to protect him. And on the other hand, for the first time, Rome is talking about Luther, or maybe the second time, I guess. Cajetan and the Pope are talking about Luther. And you see sort of the 2 camps starting to plan their strategies about what to do about this problem of Luther. And then one of the most important scenes, I think, in the film, and certainly the most creative scene in the film, I really like it, is the wild boar hunt. And again, it's one of these cases of how do you portray ideas in film and make them seem alive and active and so on. And you do it through motion and action. So we know that the Renaissance popes, in the summertime, they often went to northern Italy where it was cooler, and they went hunting, and they lived a pretty nice life. And so there's Leo doing his thing hunting, and Aleander has the temerity to interrupt him, but he's interrupting with news that Frederick won't hand over Luther. And so on goes the hunt. But in the meantime, now we start to hear the voiceover of the words of the papal bull Exsurge Domine, which called for the burning of Luther's works and ordered Luther to recant or he would be excommunicated. So, and that papal bull starts out, Exsurge Domine, rise up, O God, there's a wild boar in your vineyard, wreaking havoc, and so on. And so they combine this idea of the wild boar in the vineyard with the hunt of the wild boar, and the Pope is hunting the wild boar. And in fact, there's some great cross-cutting here. And so I'm just going to flip through what happens. So they're hunting, he stopped, and then the hunt goes on, and they race through the forest, and then this is all in just a matter of a couple of seconds of film. Leo throws the spear. We cross-cut to Luther looking back in the direction of where Leo was. Back to Leo looking towards Luther. Luther looking down. What's he looking down at? He's looking down at the wild boar who's been speared, which is him, right? He's the wild boar. And then we flash back to Leo looking down and spinning and riding off, and there's the wild boar on the ground. So I think it's actually a fairly creative sort of little use of a montage in a film to get at this idea. And so this now has us at 1520. Now there's a question, Rolf, did he have enough followers this time to put others in danger as well? At this point, the practices, like in church services and so on, were still Catholic. They weren't doing anything. They weren't doing anything particularly different yet in such a way that would endanger anybody. They were still effectively functioning within the Catholic framework. It's more in the realm of ideas and criticisms that the conflict is in. Okay? So we have another two camps event after that, and that is now Aleander's in Germany burning Luther's works, and there's lots of conflict around that. Immediately we cut to Luther, and this happened. He responds to the papal bull, excommunicating him by burning it. And so there's fire versus fire, and the two camps are working against each other now, and it's the conflict is intensifying, right? And Karlstadt says, yeah, and feed the fire, burn the canon law, and they burn the canon law, which is all the church law, representing the authority of the church, right? And now we have a little bit of a political scene where Peter Ustinov, in his last role, I think he died soon after this, earned the right for the trial of Luther in Germany. And that's a nice little scene. And you might ask, how are these two people? But I mean, Frederick is very savvy. He's an old, wise ruler. He knows how things work. Charles is young and looks a little bit, not the brightest bulb. So Frederick gets his way. And now we come to what is in many ways the climax of the film. And this is kind of a strange thing about the film. And wisdom versus bluster. It is kind of the climax of the film. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But it's this sort of key event, and it is a very important event in the early part of the Reformation. Luther comes to the Diet of Worms. And he is very much, like, the crowds are cheering, and he's very much a hero. You can see he is looking very determined or disturbed, take your pick, kind of some combination of the two. I tried to get, trying to get an image of him, like he looked like this all the way through this scene. And we have a series of unfolding events. Staupitz comes on the scene again to kind of be his support, but things are different now. Staupitz is trying to kind of convince him to tone it down and to stay within the church. And at that point, Luther grabs his hand and says, did you not, that day you sent me out so boldly to change the world, did you think there wouldn't be a cost? Did you think there? And so Luther's finding his own way now, and the break in the church even is coming between Staupitz and himself. And then he appears before the Diet, and he's, accused of writing these books and so on. He asks for a day, and we have another of his arguments with the devil, and he's in this anxious place. And he's angry that the devil is tempting him not to speak out, not to be bold and speak out. And so that's why the next day he's able to make his famous speech. And I think this is such an important moment. We don't actually have to talk about this tonight, because on Friday we're going to talk about the Luther's defense at the Diet of Worms. And so I want to come back to this on Friday, that this question of what exactly is the nature of the conflict here in Worms. But we can see that more effectively through the document of his defense. And so we'll come back to that. Now, at this point, then Aleander and Charles condemn him, and that certainly did happen. He was condemned and as I said last day, made an outlaw. So he'd been excommunicated and outlawed by this point. Now, you might ask, is the film over? Because it feels a bit like it is. But the film doesn't end there. And the question is, why not? Now, we only have a few minutes. We can stay on a bit longer. I'm happy to do that. But I want to not go too much longer. But the question is, I think we're actually going to do what the film does, which is spend all our time getting to 1521 and then race to the end. This feels like the climax of the film. Luther has made his stand, and he's broken with the church. Why doesn't the film end there? That's the question. Why doesn't the film end there? What do you think?
Rolf's got a comment there that
he has to get married. Yeah, that's true. That is a good answer. It is part of the issue. He has to get married. He hasn't established a new church yet. Good. There's ambiguity of the legacy. Yeah, what's going to happen? Resolution. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, there's no resolution anywhere really. I mean, well, there is, but you know, as a movie maker, as a filmmaker, you could resolve it after the defense of the died. You could say, oh, Luther went on to, you know, start new churches, translate the Bible, and da-da-da-da-da. And, you know, you could end it there. But I think the issue is there's some other important events. And we, like, how can we stop the film before we have Luther's translation of the Bible, before he gets married, and maybe even before we have the establishment of Lutheran churches or something like that. Oh yeah, that little thing called the Peasant Wars. So we have to think about what other events there, and this, it is kind of funny, I have to confess. I do sort of chuckle because from this point in the film, it's like they're doing double time. They really pick up the pace because they got about 20 minutes left, and they're going to get through a bunch of events, or 40 minutes left. I forget exactly when we're on the film. Anyway, let's go on. I'll be very brief about this. The film basically exposits or shows us and explains just a couple of other events that are important for the story of the Reformation. One is Luther's translation of the scriptures. So he's kidnapped when he leaves Worms. He's kidnapped by Frederick the Wise, his ruler, kidnapped to protect him because he could be killed otherwise. He would have been killed otherwise. And so he's smuggled off to the Wartburg, and he translates the scriptures. He's kind of grumpy during this time. I don't know if you noticed that. And I'm actually not sure about that. I'm assuming the filmmakers must have found things in his correspondence from that time that he's frustrated. I forget. I don't have that front of mind, but I can only assume because his character takes a noticeably grumpy turn here.
He's grumpy in everything he writes.
What?
He's grumpy in everything he writes.
Man.
Lots of, like, his writing is very acerbic. This seems more like him to me.
Yeah, okay. That could be. Then we have to there's another thing we have to figure out, and that is Karlstadt is stirring up Wittenberg. And when Luther was in the Wartburg, Karlstadt, his former professor and then colleague, sort of took control, or was at least one of the key leaders in Wittenberg. And then, Rolf, this comes back to your question, then they actually started to make concrete changes to the way that they did church. German Mass, regular clothes, keeping the tithes for local use, and so on. Yeah, there you go. And so they're starting to radicalize now. And so we see that in the film. Now, that boils over, and here we have a very significant conflation of two events. It's okay that they did that, but it does need to be said. What they've done is they've combined the radicalism that was happening in Wittenberg in 1521 and 22, when there was a little bit of iconoclasm, a little bit of destruction of images, and then some radical ideas were taking root. Luther comes back in 1522 to sort of settle that down. But they're conflating that with the larger event of the Peasant Wars in 1524-25. where between 100 and 300,000 peasants were killed. And so they show that kind of wrapped up together. And here he is dressed as Junker Jorg, Knight George, coming back to Wittenberg. But we've got the peasant wars kind of interwoven with that in the film. So you just have to know that. Then, of course, we need Katharina von Bora here yet. I like the way Claire Cox plays her. She's suitably feisty. Katharina was, and she ran Luther's whole household. It's amazing. If you go to Wittenberg and the Luther House Museum, which is a great museum, they've got quite a nice feature on Katie. And she was like the largest, I think she was the largest landowner or in the region, or cattle. I mean, they had sort of meat production. They made beer. They had like dozens of people in their home a lot of the time, students and visitors and so on. And she ran a very, very big household. And so she really made Luther's life work. And so she has to show up in the film, and here she woos Luther, and they get married. And then we have one last two camps set of scenes juxtaposed with one another. We have kind of the culmination of Frederick's role. Frederick's old by now, and Luther goes to meet him and give him a Bible, give him a New Testament. Now, I think it says New Testament in the film, which would be 1522 when they finished the New Testament. 1534 was the whole Bible. But we have no record that Luther and Frederick ever met. They might have, it could well have been, but there's no sort of explicit recording of them meeting. But the filmmakers want them to meet, so they meet. And it's a suitable moment to kind of wrap up Frederick's role by Luther giving him a Bible, which is the fruition of the Reformation, right? The Reformation eventuates in the scriptures. On the other side, the other camp, it's like the victory of the Protestants and the defeat of the Catholics, because Leo has died. Actually, Leo died already in 1521. Before this, but anyway, here we are. And the church is deep in debt, and things are in disarray. And yes, Luther was very well fed by Katie. He did get much bigger in stature. So Fiennes gives us early Luther, skinny Luther. He'd have to put on an awful lot of weight to play late Luther, who was very rotund indeed. But anyway, this third two camps set of scenes, the first with Frederick and Spalatin on the one hand, and Aleander and Cajetan and Leo on the other. The second with Aleander and Luther burning things. The third, now this. So the film does a neat job of showing these two camps in conflict, and this is the sort of wrapping up of that conflict. Okay? And then we have one thing left. We have to find an endpoint to the film, and because it's a Lutheran film, the Augsburg Confession would be a great place to end it. And so they take us to the Diet of Augsburg in 1530. Luther could not go there. He had to stay within Saxony, or else he would have been in very much physical danger indeed. But the Diet is in Augsburg in Bavaria. The princes all go there, and we have this moment. And I don't know if they did anything this dramatic, but they do in the film. And it gives us a second climactic moment. And Melanchthon's able to come back and shout, "We did it, we did it." And they had to listen to us read out our confession. Thank you for the link to the Augsburg Confession. And it's in the Book of Concord. And you can see the ideas. And again, they don't have a great way to present those ideas. They talk about them a little bit, but they demonstrate it by their actions. And that takes us through the film. But I want to say one more thing quickly, if I can. And then we can talk a bit more. Characters. Hannah and Greta. I have not mentioned them all this hour, and I want to talk about them for a minute. Who are Hannah and Greta? Who are Hannah and Greta, and what do we know about them historically?
isn't that the mother and her child that's physically disabled?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I don't even know if they're real people. Are they real people historically?
No, no, they're not real people.
Yeah, I wondered.
No. So it's a bit of a trick question. What do we know about them historically? Nothing. They're not historical. So what are they doing in the film? Why are they in the film? Do we just need a few more women in the film? Well, maybe. The Reformation is a pretty male event at this point. So maybe that's part of it. But what are they doing in the film? So any question, symbols of indulgence purchase, very good. But think even broader than that, Lisa and others. What are they doing in the film? What role do they play?
Precursor to Hansel.
Yeah, not quite.
No.
What role do they play?
I mean, bridging off of what Lisa says there, one of the things I'd suggest is that they humanize some of the problems that that the Reformation is trying. Again, it's about trying to humanize the ideas that we're dealing with.
Yeah. 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 Humanize Luther. Good, Lisa. Yeah. Yeah. Demonstration of the gospel for the weak and the oppression of the weak. Yeah. Yeah. I would say to you in very real terms, like again, films have to do this all through characters, right? So the sort of most concise way I could say it is that Hannah and Greta represent what we call the popular Reformation. So the influence of the Reformation on common people and the way that the common people get taken up with, captivated with, and then often disenchanted with the Reformation. So let me walk you through the scenes. We first meet Hannah when Luther first comes to Wittenberg in the film. She's selling wood to care for her daughter, who she's got hidden in the woods because her daughter's disabled and she shouldn't be in public, kind of thing. And so her first reaction to Luther is suspicious because, like Otto and his family, they think Luther, the new priest, wants to take their money. So she is suspicious of him as a kind of a predator, as not a personally predatory, but in the way that the church is predatory, taking their money. Then she's watching when Luther buries Thomas, the boy who committed suicide. And again, that's a fictitious event. She's fictitious. Karlstadt is also there watching the people in their responses. But she and her daughter, we see Greta for the first time, and they are watching Luther. What is he doing? What is he saying? What's this about mercy? Oh, maybe he's not predatory. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's actually loving and caring. And so when Luther then preaches right after that and preaches about God's love, there they are in church. They come to take communion. They bring him a bowl of berries as a gift, and they're smiling, and they're now captivated. They're now embracing the Reformation ideas. But then Hannah goes a few miles away to the town of Jüterbock. Indulgences couldn't be sold in Wittenberg. That was in Saxony. They weren't allowed to be sold in Saxony. Frederick wanted the money from the relics instead. But a few miles away across the border into Brandenburg, I think it was, is Jüterbock. And that's where Tetzel came, and a bunch of Wittenbergers went there. And Hannah goes there. And when Tetzel's preaching indulgences, they unroll this banner, and there's a woman that looks just like Hannah, and she's in hell. And she is scared about that. And then Tetzel preys upon her in the service, saying, better make sure that your daughter can run to Jesus. And so she goes and buys the indulgence, and she's happy about that. And she comes rushing back to Wittenberg and tells Luther, look what I've done for Greta. And he says, it's not worth anything. And she is confused, and then she is upset. And this represents the kind of confusion of common people in having to abandon their traditional supports, spiritually speaking, you might say, for the Reformation. But things get better. And after Luther preaches another nice message before he goes to Augsburg about Christ in the community and in the sacraments and in the Word of God, after church, there's Greta, and she's starting to walk. And in fact, this symbolizes, and Martin reimburses her. And this symbolizes the Reformation is getting somewhere. It's starting to walk. It's starting to move. And this actual physical motion of Greta is like the Reformation learning to walk. But then, the next time we meet them is when there's the violence in Wittenberg and they're in danger from the violence. And in fact, after the Peasant Wars, we see Greta's crutches, and there she is, and she's been killed. And the popular Reformation is dead. And now Luther has to lean on the magistrates, on the princes. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about Hannah and Greta. They're very interesting characters. They're fictitious, but they serve a very particular device to help us see the Reformation coming alive in ordinary people and then not coming alive. So that's the film, Luther. It's another way to see the story of the Reformation. We pick up on certain very important themes. And we'll come back to that on Friday when we look at some of those documents. And we'll talk specifically about the defense at Worms and sort of get our heads around the kind of conflict there. And that'll help us. We'll flash back to the movie at that point too. Just wanted to leave you with a thought about Luther biographies. Scott Hendricks is quite useful. It is the most balanced of the biographies chronologically that I've ever seen, because it's about half of it would come on stuff that the movie doesn't even touch. Luther's later life after the Reformation is established. And it really very much puts him within a community. He's not the lone hero in this book. He works with others. Brand Luther is interesting because it highlights the role of printing very powerfully. Printing and publishing in the Reformation. So it tells Luther's story, but significantly through the printing press. And then Lyndall Roper has written a recent biography. I have not read that one. I've read the other two. I've not read Renegade and Prophet, but it is more social and cultural, and it's also supposed to be quite good from what I've heard about it. So any last comments about the film, some of the questions, other questions you might have, or comments about it, about things that you noticed? Yeah, Carl Trueman is another biography of Luther too. Tony Smith has raised a hand. I see that, but I don't see you, Tony. But go ahead, ask a question.
You're probably muted. Here, I'll unmute you, Tony, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah. How about adding another sola? What I'm thinking of is the phrase in English, by the initiative of God alone. It could be sola initiando Dei or sola initiato Dei. And the idea is that at the root of everything is the initiative of God.
Yeah. One of the other solas that comes up is Solo Deo Gloria. No. Soli Deo Gloria. Which the glory of God alone, which is often added to the list of solas. It was added more recently. The ones that are highlighted most early on, like from the 16th century on, are the three I mentioned of Scripture, grace, and faith, and then the priesthood of all believers. But yeah, I mean, there are other ways to see this too, and one is to see the initiating work of God in it. As a historian, that makes things a little tricky, because we historians may believe, as I do, that God works in the world very tangibly. But within the discipline of history, that's a little hard sometimes to talk about because we look for evidence, and evidence gets interpreted in many different ways. And so we're used to working more at the level of secondary causes and thinking more about how are people responding. How are people responding to God? How are people responding to God's word? How, in faith or in fear and in, antagonistically, or so. I'm personally more interested in thinking about the way people are responding in history, but certainly, behind it all, God's at work too. The problem with sometimes emphasizing that in history is you end up tying God to people then. So with Luther, for instance, many people have sort of turned him into a hero in that sense, and he's God's instrument and so on. But there are some pretty ugly sides of Luther, including just a wicked anti-Semitism and some very brutal language to his enemies and so on, that, so like any person, he's problematic, right? So I find for myself, I'm more interested in thinking about him as a human and just sort of, how is God at work? Early translation, there was Wycliffe and the Lollards were working on English translations. William Tyndale, of course, Coverdale. Colin knows more about this than I do, but
Those are the
and
early
of course
ones,
the
I
King
think.
James later on. But
Yeah. And there weren't there some
ask-
others like around the just around Europe? There were other attempts at vernacular translations.
oh yeah.
I just don't remember any other ones.
Well, there are
Like Wycliffe.
there are French Bibles,
Yeah.
and for sure.
Perhaps I could suggest that speaking about by God's initiating only would be more characteristic of Calvin than Luther.
Well, yes. Certainly in Calvin's, we're going to talk about him a week Friday, and certainly there you have the Reformed tradition, which is very much more emphasizing the sovereignty of God, and we'll come to that for sure.
Thank you.
On Lisa's question, it's also worth noting that not all vernacular translations were complete. There were various incomplete or partial. Another example of this would be Psalters, especially. The Book of Psalms was often translated partially or in its entirety in a whole bunch of varied forms. So like bits and pieces or Gospels, like bits and pieces would be translated sometimes vernacularly as well. Entire Bibles, I'm not even sure, Kyle, do you remember Wycliffe didn't finish a full translation, right? Somebody...
I off the top of my head, I could not tell you.
So I think his was
I
partial.
don't think, but
Yeah, but I mean, so because it's really, really important to understand. Like Luther's vernacular translation of the entire Bible is an astonishing accomplishment. Like there's it's very difficult to help somebody understand how difficult it is to translate from the original languages into the vernacular, particularly with the tools that the reformers had at hand.
Yeah.
They did not have great manuscripts, and they did not have like the fun scene in the movie where he can't get a Greek to German dictionary, which is, I mean, that's very true. Like there's no library in the sense of like a place you can go to get a giant repository of books. It's very difficult to do this work.
Erasmus had done a lot of work in biblical manuscript. He had developed a fairly sound manuscript.
His New Testament manuscript,
Yeah, and so they had that. And Luther, again, this is where it's better to understand him as a leader of a team. Like once he got going on the translation, he established a whole community, a sort of a translation group, and they churned through it. So it wasn't only him working on it; they churned through it as a group, and they really got a lot of momentum that way. All right, I think we're 25 after 9, so we've gone on about an hour and 20 minutes or so tonight here, so that's probably lots. Thank you for hanging on, and I hope you enjoyed thinking about Luther's story through the film. If you haven't seen the film, now if you watch it, you'll see lots of things popping out at you, I hope. If you have seen it, maybe you want to watch it again, and you'll be surprised by the little things that'll pop out at you if you think about plot and character and things like that. So have a good night, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you on Friday. And if you have a chance, I think they've sent out the documents. Have you sent out the...
I don't know, is Tim still on here? I don't know if Tim's still on right now or not.
Oh, I was on the whole time.
Okay, good.
I'm just moving around the room and stuff, so didn't want to be distracting. Yeah, the document has been sent out to people who registered prior to Monday, but we'll send a follow-up with the document as well to ensure everyone's covered.
Yeah, please do.
Great.
And again, it's a little long. I'm sorry. The reformers wrote a lot. Don't feel put off if you can't get through it all, or if some of it doesn't make sense or whatever. We'll sort of have a look at all the documents, and we'll be able to make something out of all of them along the way on Friday. So have a good night, everyone, and we will see you again hopefully in 2 days.
I'll also send out a link to the Luther movie along with those documents for those who haven't been able to find it. It will be on either iTunes, and I think there's a YouTube version as well. So, but yeah, I'll send that out with that.
Well,
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
All right.
everybody.
Many thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Everybody's signing off. All right, there we go. Have a good night, Tim.
Later.
See ya.